Before you watch this video, first read the two articles that have been assigned to the materials. One article is by Niles, the other is by Maureen Conroy. Both of them have to do with overall classroom organization. The is for most of the class based on the philosophy of positive behavioral support. It's going to work something like this. If you have significant problems occurring in your classroom, the first thing you do before intervening intensively with an individual student is you want to fix or assess the overall classroom management. When I'm asked to take a look at a kid who's having some behavioral problems, the first thing I do is I look at how the classroom operates as a whole. The first thing I want to do is fix those problems because they are going to affect the largest number of students. They're also things that simply need to be in place before you go any further. If you still have problems occurring after you've addressed overall classroom issues, then you do more intensive kinds of assessment and analysis. Those are things we're going to spend a lot of time talking about throughout this course. Those are only things that you should do once you've fixed basic classroom-wide problems. Once you have classroom-wide supports in place, though, and you still have problems, and you will, about 80% of students are going to respond to class-wide interventions. There's going to be about 20% that are going to need something more intensive. That 20%, most of them are going to respond to things you can apply to whole groups. There's going to be a small percentage of students for whom you're going to need to develop more intensive, individualized interventions. But this is a continuous cycle. It's something you should always do. As a teacher, you should always be reflective. You should always evaluate what you're doing, monitor your own behavior, and adjust it accordingly. So it's effective teachers learn to do that all the time. The overall practices we're going to talk about form the foundation for everything else. They're things that you need for a classroom to be successful. Overall, you want your students to perceive your classroom as a very positive place to be in. If you establish very good basic classroom procedures and you have good classroom management practices, a lot of problems won't occur. You can manage a lot of behavior problems or prevent them simply by having an effective instructional environment. You will not eliminate problems. You're still going to have some problems that are going to require more, but you're going to be better able to focus on the more intensive problems. So minor kinds of things might not happen. Appropriate behaviors are more likely to develop, and students are more likely to maintain or continue to use appropriate behaviors if you have a positive, effective environment. We'll talk about the individual components that go into making that up. Also, when you do have to develop more intensive formal plans, they're more likely to work. You can't take an individual kid in isolation and address behavioral issues. You have to look at the whole context. It's also less likely that you're going to have to use more restrictive or intrusive interventions if you have effective positive procedures. Things that you want to consider. Well, you want to consider the physical layout of the classroom. Is it comfortable? Is it a good place to be? Is the temperature regulated? Is there adequate lighting? Is there fresh air? Are the noise levels conducive to kids learning? One of my students once taught a self-contained EBD classroom. She worked with kids with emotional and behavioral disorders in elementary school. Her classroom was right off the gym. She was having lots of issues with classroom management. I spent half a day in her classroom, and I had a horrible headache, and I was amazed that those kids could attend at all. The noise level was absolutely just incredible. She could not get a different classroom, but I went with her to the administrator, and we were able to work some things out with scheduling so that when the gym was being used for things that were really noisy, her kids could be in the library or they could be somewhere else. And she also worked at scheduling academic times during periods of the day when it was going to be less noisy. So we had to work around the situation that was there. Is there enough space? Do you have areas in the classroom designated for the different kinds of activities your students are going to do? In other words, do you have a clear place for independent work? Do you have a place for group work, for kids to work together in small groups? Do you have a place designated for free time? Do you have, if you're going to use some kind of timeout procedure, and we'll talk about that later in the course, do you have a designated area in the classroom to use for that? Is the decor up to date? Again, is it a pleasant place to be? The settings in which we find ourselves have a huge influence on our behavior. Think for just a moment. I mean, we've all been to a nicer restaurant. I don't get to them very often, but if I go to a nicer sit-down restaurant, I behave very differently than I do if I go to McDonald's. That environment occasions different behavior. It's the same thing with your classroom. You want your classroom to itself become a cue to your students to behave in a certain way. You want it to be a positive place where your students want to be. It's important to have an area designated for posting information. If you have younger kids or kids that can't read words, use pictures. Change this frequently so that students actually learn to go and look at it. If you leave the same stuff up for a long period of time, you're going to be teaching them that there's simply nothing there of any use. So every few days, put something else there. Put some important information there. Consider the locations of students. I mean, it seems sort of self-evident, but where are the more difficult kids going to want to sit? They're going to want to sit as far away from you as possible, and they're going to want to sit next to each other. So consider where students are located. Locate your students to effectively manage the environment. Locate your students and yourself so that you've got constant view of where they are. You're going to, many of you, if you haven't already, some of you may be paraprofessionals, and you certainly will be working with paraprofessionals. It's extremely important that you learn to communicate effectively with your teaching team. I'll spend some time talking about this later in the semester, but it's important to develop a good working relationship with the people in your classroom. They are your team. They need to feel that their input is welcome and appreciated, and you need to involve them in decisions that are going to affect what they do. Also, you need to establish clear expectations for how you want everyone to interact with your students. Some important practices to get to establish: effective use of pacing, prompting, and reinforcement. In other words, you want to pace instruction so that it's delivered with a rapid pace. This makes it more stimulating for kids. It keeps students more engaged. Use prompting to facilitate correct answers. In other words, give students the amount of assistance they need without giving them too much. Learn how to use reinforcement effectively. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about effective reinforcement, but it's usually people simply don't do enough. The ratio to giving students positive feedback and reinforcement to some kind of correction should be at least 5-to-1. In other words, for every time you give a student a correction, you should at least be giving them 4 or 5 praise statements or giving them feedback about something they've done appropriately. You'll see a huge change in the behavior of your students if you institute this practice consistently. It's extremely important with any group of students to have a clear, structured schedule. Most of my life I've worked with kids with autism and kids with emotional and behavioral disorders. For both those groups of students, it's extremely important that you have clear expectations. A schedule is a way that you can ensure predictability, you minimize the level of downtime, you make transitions go much more smoothly. There is literally tons of research information that shows us that schedules, very tightly structured routines, are extremely important. it's extremely important to also have very clear expectations. If I go into a classroom that's having difficulty and I'm asked to give some recommendations, the first thing I want to find are what the expectations are. They should be clearly posted. They should be available to all students. If you have students that don't read, they need to be available in terms of pictures. So they need to be clearly communicated. They need to be positively stated. That means that your expectation is worded in terms of what you want students to do, not in terms of what you don't want students to do. There are a number of reasons for this. The best reason is the fact that, well, it goes down with the bottom one there, minimum number. You don't want a lot of them. You want 4 or 5, maybe 6 expectations for older kids. It's important to keep the number down because you want these to be integrated into your interactions with the students. If you have do not do rules, you could have 100, you could have 500. Within 30 minutes, the kids are going to find out the 501st thing that you didn't mention. If they're stated positively, you can have an effective set of rules with 5 or 6. It also helps you reinforce students. You're reinforcing students for what they're actually doing. If your behavioral expectations of your classroom are developed in terms of positively stated behaviors, it makes it much more easy to do that. The examples in the Conroy article are very helpful here. It's important that you directly explain and teach each of the expectations to your students. At the beginning of the school year, take several days on each expectation. Don't do them all at once. Depending on the nature of the students you're working with, you're going to have to do more modeling and role play. You may have to do multiple examples. You may have to remind students about them frequently. What I used to do when I was working with younger kids with autism is I would take one expectation every week, and I would role play it with someone. For instance, if we had an expectation that was respect other people's property, I would role play what it meant to respect property. I'd have different examples. One example might be that you Sorry about that. A dog walked by outside and my labs were barking. I would spend time role-playing the expectation. I do different examples. One example might be asking someone to borrow something. Another might be if I found something, I would show it to the teacher. So I would role-play this, and then I'd have kids role-play it as well. I'd use multiple examples. Later on, I would use negative examples sometimes. I would show an example of what is not respecting other people's property. That might be misusing something or taking something that didn't belong to me. I would only introduce the negative examples later on, though. Once you teach them, you have to review them. Periodically throughout the school year, go over them. Also, the most important thing is when students are following these expectations and you're giving them feedback, label what they're doing. Say, that was great. You really respected his property when you found that and you brought it to me. And as we said, you want fairly few of these. You don't want more than 4 or 5. We'll be spending a lot of time later on talking about incentive or management plans, but most of the time you're going to want some kind of structured reinforcement procedures in your classroom. The Conroy article describes the good behavior game. That's a basic reinforcement program that I've used myself many times. Review that example. It's not the only type of reinforcement program you can use in a classroom. We'll be talking about others later on. But whatever system you use, you want it to focus on appropriate behavior. You want it to focus on students earning reinforcement for appropriate behavior. And it's better when it is tied back in with your classroom expectations. It's less that students have to learn. So when I developed classroom management plans, I always arranged it so that my reinforcement program fit my classroom expectations. Those were the behaviors the students were being reinforced for doing. And of course, with any plan, you want to explain it, you want to teach it to your students so they understand it. Some things that you should consider just in general interactions with your students. Don't sit behind a desk and expect to teach. You have to get out. You have to move around. You have to be monitoring your students, and there's something we'll talk about later on called proximity control. And that's simply by being near a situation, you're going to prevent problems from occurring. So if your students know that you're out moving around, they're less likely to get into trouble, quite honestly. It also puts you in a better position to give attention and praise and positive feedback to students. We talked about brisk pacing already, or maintaining a steady pace of instruction. We'll spend time later on talking about effective instructional practices. What does direct instruction mean? In the Conroy article, she talked about opportunities to respond. Opportunities to respond mean that you're giving your student Opportunities to respond means that you're providing your students with a way to respond to instruction, either with responding verbally or having students point to something, or if you want to use technology, clickers or classroom response systems are effective ways to go. The advantage of this is, first of all, not only does it maintain really brisk pacing, but if your students are responding in such a way that they are indicating whether or not they understand what you're teaching, it gives you a way to constantly monitor how well you're teaching. If it's clear to you that students don't understand something, you can teach it in a different way. Again, the Conroy article gives you some very good examples of this. And then there's pre-correction. Pre-correction is very simple and it's very effective. If there's a situation that you know may be a problem for your students, stop them, get their attention, remind them of the appropriate behavior, and even have them practice the appropriate behavior before they go into the situation. The example I always think of is, let's say that you're teaching at a school, you're working with young kids, it's a real nice day outside, kids are outside playing, you're going to go in from the outside, you know that the rest of the school is taking standardized tests. What are you going to do before you take your students into that building? Well, of course, you're going to stop them. You're going to remind them to be quiet when they're walking down the hallway. You might even have them begin that while they're still outside, and then give them feedback, and then have them go into the building. So pre-correction can be very important. Also, we're going to be talking later on about teaching social skills to kids. Reminders before the kids go into situations are very important, especially when they're learning new skills or they're learning different ways of dealing with situations that have been problems for them in the past. So we'll talk more about pre-correction later. When problem behaviors do occur, it's important to have an effective way to respond to them. I like to think of treating problem behaviors as learning errors. You know, kids behave for a reason. They engage in problem behavior for a reason. Those behaviors are reinforced and strengthened because they meet students' needs in some way. The most effective way of changing behavior long term is to teach your students another way to get their needs met. And we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about that throughout the course. But when problem behaviors occur, I like to have a way of responding so that I stop the student, I give them some feedback, and then I have them practice the correct way of behaving. So, depending on the reason for the behavior, if it's a way that your student is, for instance, getting your attention through some problem behavior, well, first of all, I want to be sure that the way I respond is not going to give the student a lot of attention, because I don't want to reinforce the problem behavior. But I want to in some way cue the student what he or she is supposed to do. That's really what redirection is. People talk about redirection a lot. Redirection is simply responding to a behavior by indicating to the student to do something else. And when the student changes and does the other behavior, you give them feedback for it. So we'll spend more time talking about this later on as well, but it's important that you think about an effective way to respond to problems when they happen, and you communicate that very clearly to everyone who's working with the student. Establish clear procedures for communication between the teacher and the student. For example, how do you want your students to ask questions in different situations? How do you want your students to ask questions of each other? Decide the procedure you're going to use and teach it to everyone. You know, there are other situations or other procedures as well. If you're going to have students work in small groups, spend time teaching your students how to behave in small groups, especially if they don't have a lot of experience with it. A model that I've used for many years is I would teach kids a number system. I would use the numbers 1, 2, and 3 on big cards I'd put up at the front of the room, and we would practice this. If number 1 was up there, it meant that the expectation was that I am talking, I expect you to listen to me. If you have a question or if you have something to add, you need to raise your hand and wait for me to call on you, and then either ask your question or make your comment. That's not always what the expectation is, though. If it's a less structured time and students are working in small groups, you want them to be able to talk to one another and collaborate, but you don't want them to become so loud they're interfering with everyone else. So when I put a number 2 at the front of the room, that meant voice level 2 means that you talk quietly to the students sitting right in your group. But if you're talking so loud that the next group can hear you clearly and understand what you're saying, then you're talking too loud. And we'd spend time practicing that. And then voice level 3 simply meant that this was free time. You could talk with your friends, but you still had to be reasonably quiet so that you didn't disturb the next classroom. Once I taught this to students, I found that it greatly reduced the number of times that students talked without permission or became disruptive. It made the expectations very clear. When you design your schedule, be sure that you have a variety of different kinds of activities. Give students opportunities for choices when possible. You want to make things interesting. It's a good idea sometimes, if you know that some instructional activities are going to be less preferred, alternate more and less preferred activities when you do your schedule. Be sure that you include, that you appropriately schedule. Sorry about that. My dog was getting in trouble and I had to go and take care of it. Be aware of medical issues with your students. If you have students on medications or if you have students with allergy problems or sleep difficulties, those things can all affect a student's behavior. So I always kept a log when I would see issues like that, and I would look for connections with the student's behavior, or I wanted to be sure that I communicated things with home. All the things we've been talking about are things that we'll do before or as part of a functional behavior assessment. Functional behavior assessment is a process of looking at a behavior that's occurring and trying to understand why it's occurring. All the things that we've discussed are a big part of that. We have to look at the context in which the person functions.